All right. Welcome to Understanding Healthcare with Zach Cantor. Today we have my guest, Brendan Keeler, who's the interoperability practice lead at HCD Health and author of the Health API Guy Substack, which, if you haven't read it, it's a fantastic blog and was prominently featured recently in the epic version of the Acquired podcast. I think it's 12 or 13 different references in there. I lost count at some point. So welcome, Brendan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, I thought where we could start was a conversation that you and I have had before a number of times is that everybody complains about healthcare and says that it's broken and it's backwards, on the clinical side, on the administrative side, that there's a lack of standardization, that there's so many payer specific differences, but it seems like you and I are on the same page that to some extent that's not true. That there's when you compare healthcare, which certainly has its challenges, to the other industries that are out there, logistics and retail, and all the different ways that goods and services are moved around, that healthcare actually has a lot of advantages. Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think people were kind of babies about this, or just come from everything's relative. And so, like, if you come from consumer tech, a relatively nascent industry that's greenfield, you're like, oh wow, like I'm used to all these APIs, I'm used to all this, or I'm being very tech forward. And you come in and you see the cruft accrued from 50 years of technology, and so like that is scary to you because it is different, it is older, and yeah, like it is cognitive load. But we are blessed with many things in healthcare. You're blessed as a regulatorily burdened industry. Health technology cuts two ways, but the standards that we have that are promulgated nationally at national scale, that doesn't exist in other industries. Like you're going to you're banging on the door of each CRM and saying, what kind of APIs do you got or don't have? You're banging on the door of each property management system in Yardi and, a real page. And they're saying, hey, get the hell out of here. And they're all different. And like other industries, other verticals would beg, B2B verticals are the comparison point. And if you start to look in that way versus consumer tech or horizontal tech, you get a fair comparison and you go, oh boy, how lucky are we? How lucky are we that we have the beauty of the HIPAA, administrative standards, the X12, how the beauty, but the standardization, the uniformity of some sort, the ubiquity that you can rely on, that being some lingua franca. That's different, and it very viscerally, and your guys pivot, out of, or into healthcare, and seizing the opportunity. I think that's yeah, I don't know. I mean, you guys made that choice for a variety of reasons, but I have to imagine it felt nice coming from commerce.
Yeah, it's funny, when I also call X12 beautiful, and if you look at the format, certainly it's not the easiest thing on the eyes, but that's because it was designed to be space efficient. From when data was very expensive in the 80s and the 90s and before. The funny thing about it is that if we didn't have X12 and specifically the HIPAA administrative simplification rules that say that everybody has to use the 5010 version of X12 and a very specific implementation of it within that. And people say, well, the problem is that we don't have APIs. And sorry that to pick on the API guy here, but the problem is that we don't have APIs. But imagine we didn't have any standards, and you wave your magic wand. Everybody has chosen to use JSON based APIs. All the payers, all the EHR, EMR, practice management, RCM systems have all built their APIs. The reality is that there's going to be like a few people who have done a pretty good job of designing those APIs. But even amongst the people who have designed those APIs well, there's going to be wildly different implementations of it. And then on top of that, you're going to have a much broader variety in terms of the quality and design decisions that are made. So the fact that everybody, if you told me, hey, we're going to get everybody onto a single standard, it's going to be archaic, it's going to be new, whatever it is, I would say you're wasting your time. It's, that's a pipe dream. So the fact that it exists is like one of the wonders of the world of US commerce. And the fact that the format can be a little bit challenging to work with and isn't accessible via modern programming languages, at least we have a format.
Yeah, I mean, it's trade-offs, right? Like, I'll play foil here. I agree with you. We agree with each other, but I'll play foil, right? Like, you know, in that API world, maybe it's potentially some are more usable, right? Like some are this beautiful developer experience. It's easy for to do the jobs to be done. The tooling is there, and the lack of tooling, the lack of that usability, that diff provides some opportunity for aspirant companies looking to enter the space and provide value there, right? Like Steady does a great job of filling that void that people have come to expect from working on iOS or working on platform, ubiquitous platforms, but their ubiquity is by virtue of market dominance, not by share, in a disparate, more fragmented market. It's much harder to get that experience that you have on dominant platforms like Microsoft or Windows or iOS or Android. And so like that's the diff. And just because of the market structure, we have to have something different. And standards are what we have. And I think we have X12 on the clinical side. We're blessed with these FHIR APIs to pull clinical data in a uniform fashion across 250 EHRs. That's crazy, right? Like, can you imagine in lieu of that banging down the door and going, all right, what kind of connectivity you got? And they're like, we don't have anything. That is the experience in other B2B verticals. And beyond that, now we have this information blocking law that's, there's standards in other industries to some degree, in some verticals. None as prevalent, not as many as we have in healthcare for as many of these use cases, but they exist. Nobody really has information blocking law, which now is this pro-competitive law that allows point solutions to go to systems of record and say, hey, actually, my user is your user, and by virtue of that, you got to let me in and connect. That's really wonky. That's market changing. The equilibrium and the powers, right? Helmer's powers are just totally changed by that, because things like switching costs, things like network effects, well, this can be undone more easily when you have a statutory right to go and push back and connect against the natural tendencies of systems of record of software vendors. So, maybe it's a government overreach, maybe it's not. I think it's really an interesting policy experiment. And so like those tools, the APIs, X12, HL7, like those exist and are unique, by and large, and take that corpus of work. That's a lot of cool stuff that makes people's jobs easier.
Yeah, you're touching on a number of interesting points. I think you touched on the idea of what is different about the world of healthcare versus commerce and logistics, where Steady started off as a broad play EDI platform, which EDI is the underlying technology that was mandated by HIPAA, but it's used for issuing purchase orders. Walmart uses that, and Amazon uses that for issuing purchase orders, not because they have to; they're not regulated to do so, but because the rough history of this is that Walmart pushed the adoption of X12 EDI in the 80s. And then when Amazon came onto the scene in the 90s, the easiest way for them to onboard lots and lots of vendors who were already working with the big box retailers was to use the same standard that Walmart and the other big guys were using. So all of Amazon was built on X12 EDI. And so people often ask, well, okay, Steady started off in doing logistics, retail, healthcare, et cetera. And why did we narrow down and say, okay, we're going forward just going to do healthcare? Is because, yes, it's true that they, both the retail world, logistics world, and the healthcare world all use X12, but the degree of standardization is really different. And so the first kind of, thing is to say, okay, we're going to use the X12 standard, and anybody can choose whatever version of X12. There's a bunch of releases that go back to the 70s all the way up to present. Which version are we going to use? Which release are we going to use? But the second thing is that within that is very permissive. Like there's a lot of different decisions that can be made, and what HIPAA did was it said, we're going to use a very specific, in X12, it's called a TR3, a very specific implementation guide for the claim. So whereas, in the world of logistics and retail, you can use any release that you want. Within that, you can choose any set of values that you want. The schema can look very different between Walmart and Amazon, even if they're on the same release. HIPAA defined the X12 worked with these regulations to define this TR3 implementation guide, which is, yeah, it's 650-page long PDF that explains what the parameters are for a claim, but at least there's something standardized there. Can you talk a little bit about that in the FHIR sense? Because it, my coming not from the clinical side, my loose understanding of FHIR is that FHIR, as you talk about it, overall is kind of akin to X12, which is, there's a lot of different versions. There's a lot of different parameters within there. Is there moves towards this concept of an implementation guide so that there's a lot less variety between the implementations of FHIR?
Yeah, it's always interesting. If you look at standards, one, when we set boundaries, the human condition is entropy. And like our brains all work different. And so like read the same words, see different things, make slightly different decisions. So the boundaries, the contours between implementation flexibility and prescriptiveness, people are going to expand up to the boundaries of that. And so for commerce, okay, let's go every which way. In lieu of any standard, you'll create. You and I have both looked at a lot of APIs in our days and seen a bunch, some good ones and some terrible ones, right? Like without standards, people are left to their own devices and they make different decisions. So within X12, you see anytime there's optionality or there's variance, and even when there's requirements, people misread it or miss it or make mistakes, right? Like the required field is not always as required as it seems. FHIR has everything. So FHIR, in the past decade has gone from an idea of let's just take healthcare out of the EDI era. HL7v2 is very, very close in nature to X12, right? It's pipe delimited instead of asterisk delimited. It's space constrained, sent over TCP IP or SFTP, these older technologies. And Graham Grieve and a bunch of people said, okay, let's take that, all this clinical data that's being shoveled. Let's take all the best practices of the API era. Let's do restfulness. Let's do JSON and XML, mostly JSON these days, and move to a resource-based approach. And there's people are like, oh, that's great, that's cool. We can start to use internet native technologies. Everyone's using TypeScript and Node, so that makes it really easy to parse and use in newer technologies. There are implementation guides that further specify this big sprawling standard. FHIR is huge, and some things are really well defined, and other things are really nascent and still need a few iterations to get to normative. And implementation guides, those for specific use cases, either industry bodies or for regulatory purposes, constrain and further remove the wiggle room. There's still wiggle room. There's always wiggle room. And if you get too prescriptive, we saw this with HL7v3. So in between V2 and V3, or V2 and FHIR, there was HL7v3 where they said, oh, XML and SOAP is really cool. Like this is the hot new tech, internet. And so they built these large XML documents that were extremely prescriptively constrained to the point that implementers had to break the rules to achieve certain outcomes. Like if you look at the spec, you say, I need to get this extra data element, or I need to go do something because the field is mapped to two values and I need 16. Yeah, I go break the implementation guide or spec when it's too constrained. And that's bad too. So you waffled from HL7v2 implementers field dream too flexible to CDA and HL7v3 to academic, to pie in the sky, to ivory tower, and then back again to middle ground where it's implementation friendly with implementation guides to further constrain. But people are always surprised when they go and they connect to 5 EHRs and they say, wait a minute, there's still variance. It's like, well, no shit. like the human condition is this variance, is this entropy. Every business is different. Every underlying database is different between these EHRs. And so the concept of mapping inherently induces some difference that needs to be dealt with. How lucky are we that we've minimized that with some standards? Is the optimistic viewpoint of all this work?
You're touching on one of my favorite concepts of entropy and constraining these things into a bounded set. To kind of tie it all together, if you think about there's no standards at all, then the universe, the solution set, if you ask 10 different people to come up with a specification for a purchase order, people are going to choose JSON. Some people are going to choose Open API to define that. Some people are going to use JSON schema, and some people are going to use JSON schema, draft, 5 versus 2020, and all the different, decisions that we made there. Within that, there's going to be a lot of variety within the naming of things. Someone's going to call it a product ID, and someone's going to call it a product identifier, and someone else is going to call it a ID, if whatever the different choices are that are made there. So when you constrain down to something like FHIR or X12, you're you're constraining from literally anything, kind of like whatever the human language technology allows you to do, to a much narrower subset. But within that, what our experience in retail and logistics showed is that the solution set is still pretty big. And if you look at some of these, I know X12 better than FHIR, but if you look at some of these X12 fields, for something like a product service identifier, there might be hundreds or thousands of different qualifier types. So there might be a vendor part number and a vendor item number and a supplier part number and a supplier item number. And you're like, what's the difference between those things? Can't we just collapse those all down into one? And so you make the decision to canonicalize it on your model down to one. And that works fine until you see someone who uses both vendor part number and supplier part number, and they mean different things. The the wonderful thing about X12, and it sounds like some of the newer FHIR stuff, like the Da Vinci prior auth stuff, is that it constrains that down to a much smaller set. And so the ideal thing is that you're looking at one of these fields that allows for different types of data, and there's like 2 or 3 different options there, and it's pretty clear what those things are. Is it, are you going to use ICD-10 versus something else? In some cases, you just don't have the choice.
Yeah, it's interesting. So like again, we're in this like violent agreement, which is nice, but we gotta find some foil. So what why could we be wrong? I think is a good thing to invite, or what could be changing to change this moment of agreement on standards. Well, it's not a good podcast without AI, right? And so there's an argument out there now that standardization maybe inherently becomes a little less important in the era of AI, and that deterministic software depended on deterministic standardization, right? Like this uniform language. But maybe I'm just trying to play devil's advocate and add and stir the pot. But maybe AI for data transfer reduces the value of the standardization. Instead, puts the prerogative for regulators and other things to do behavioral regulation, um, to do outcome regulation in terms of, you can have more flexibility on format, but the functional goals need to be a certain service level, a certain developer turnaround time, a certain, um, for information blocking, a certain proclivity and openness to working with other parties. I wonder in this next era if that hypothesis, which I'm on the fence about, but I see some validity to, becomes true, that regulators turn their sights a bit more on those sorts of functional outcomes and behavioral outcomes. Because you've probably experienced this, where you go to a payer site, maybe they have their X12 spec or something, and then they're just not willing to play ball. Certainly that's the case with systems of record and EHRs, where you go and knock on the door and they're like, shove off, we've got our own AI scribe, and so if you believe in regulation as promoting certain in technology goals versus pure deregulation, let the market decide, I wonder if we shift in that direction in the coming era. So that, because AI can handle some of the dirty mapping. I'm sure you guys are using AI, behind the scenes in terms of how you figure stuff out and accelerate your jobs to be done.
I think the question is, okay, what needs to be deterministically correct and what can be probabilistically correct? And so I'll pick a silly example here. I think it would be tough to make the argument, maybe you can make a counter argument, that we should do away with ICD-10 or ICD, ICD-11, whatever the version comes out, because AI can just describe it however it wants, and then another AI can unpack that. But like you're just, it's lossy compression. So the difference between I went to do some food shopping at one point in Buenos Aires, and this was before the iPhone, and my Spanish was not very good, and I came back. I was trying to make pizza, and I came back with corn, flour instead of cornmeal, and I came back with tomato paste instead of tomato sauce, and everything was just a little bit off. And I came back. I was like, what can I make with this? I can make nothing. And I see that as a similar thing where even these small miscalibrations in even a quite smart intelligence of compressing these things down would be bad.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with you. I think it doesn't remove it. It's not like, okay, wholesale, no more standards, but does it increase the importance of it as a regulatory prerogative? And, I think of our regulators, again, if you believe in them, um, to be product managers, right? They have limited product management capital to direct a nation towards an outcome. And if it's hyper focused on standards, like thou shalt use these standards, then you can't spend the same capital elsewhere. And so if you view it in that lens, it's like, all right, yeah, still mandate ICD-10, some formats, but maybe you can spend more on behavioral or functional or other outcomes. Just in the sense that if I can send something over JSON or XML, an AI
Does the
parser
wire
that,
format really? Yeah. Does the wire
yeah,
format really matter?
yeah,
Yeah, I think like the kind of counter to that is that in the world of even if everything were XML, like okay, XML is a real pain for modern developers to work with, but if you're making AI do it, then AI doesn't really care about writing XML. It's happy to write a pipe delimited thing if you want to do it in pipe delimited format. So I could make the argument that like updating these archaic, wire formats is less important when you have a machine, an agent to do the grunt work. But going back to something you said earlier, which was you were talking about the information blocking, and I think it's a really important point because there's two things in my view. I'm curious if you see any more that make this concept of transaction exchange or interoperability plausible. Maybe just not possible, but plausible and probabilistically likely that it's going to happen. One of those is this bounded universe. So going from having everything available as an option to a constrained set. And I would argue that like that work is largely done. Like it's good enough at this point. If it would be nice if that we got a few other things, I would push for some changes to the real time eligibility check. And I'm sure you have your pet things that you'd want to change. But even if nothing changed from this point forward, we've got a lot more standardization than there is in other fields, in other verticals, and I think that's great. The other part though is if everybody is forced to use these standards, but you go to integrate with your EHR and they start, or someone goes to integrate with an EHR and they won't let you have access to those APIs or file formats, then all the perfect standardization in the world is not going to do you anything. Can you talk a little bit about, like, I think people can maybe understand intuitively what information blocking means, but can you talk to us about like what is the state of affairs there?
yeah, yeah,
What is it,
totally.
and what is the state of affairs?
Yeah, it's a very broad and vague law. So it's from the 21st Century Cures Act, passed in 2016, solidified in 2020. There's many things in there, updates to EHR certification criteria, some nice, like, create a voluntary health information network. But information blocking was Congress sort of saying, we're fed up with whatever's happening over here. We think healthcare is really important. We're going to change the equilibrium. And so we're going to say that the natural market forces, which technology vendors, which providers, which people may have, we want to reorient that. And so actors, which are three classes of organization, they are providers as defined in statute. They are developers of certified health IT as defined in statute, and then health information networks, which no one really knows what that means because it's not really well defined, and people duck it all the time. They're like, no, I know I say network on my site, but I'm not. And they're probably right as it's written. But for the other two, it's kind of interesting. It's like, all right, these actors, if they inhibit the access, exchange, and use of EHI, electronic health information, so basically anything in the HIPAA designated record set that funnels up to, links to a patient in a individualized way is EHI. Lawyers are going to be like, oh God, no, they're going to quibble with this. But like that is the truth of it. Uh, if you inhibit the access, exchange, and use any of those things, That is information blocking. And you better have an exception or defined exceptions that you can claim to why you are doing those behaviors. And that's vague because that sounds really broad. So everyone, when it first came out, goes, "Oh no, like that can't be real." Like that's, and what does it mean? I was one of those. I wrote a write up on it a couple of years ago. I was like, feels like anyone can duck behind these exceptions. Well, that felt true until court cases. So people were tired of the regulators that were supposed to go investigate and enforce this. So the ASTP alongside the OIG were supposed to go and enforce this. They didn't. And so applications took this into their own hand. Third-party applications that were integrating with developers of certified health IT, notably the real-time medical systems, and an analytics application against point-click care, a skilled nursing facility AHR, sued them under state tort laws, which is this weird workaround, and said, hey, they're violating a federal statute that is unfair competition. And by virtue of that, they're breaking information blocking law. And what's crazy here, the craziness is this wasn't even standards. The application was integrating via RPA, via robotic process automation. They were scraping
Can you explain what that is for people who don't know RPA?
Yeah, sure. It's so we've talked about standards and APIs and like all the sanctioned interfaces, the things that software developers create for other software to connect. Well, the user interface is a way for software to connect to the human user, typically. Well, RPA is a myriad series of technologies. There's subvariants and subvariants that you can delve into, but that say, oh well, robots, computers, can use that same interface, that same surface area, and it's existed forever in different forms, but it's historically been brittle. It's been resented, right? It wasn't designed for robots; it was designed for humans. There's intellectual property considerations, and so by and large, like that as an access pattern, that has been something that software vendors resent. Screen scraping is the pejorative of RPA.
And so
And so
it's an escape hatch when an API is unavailable or insufficient.
totally, right? Like you think of the superset, APIs do small bound of what they've developed. They say, this is what I want to expose. Well, they expose far more to the human user. And so
Not
APIs
us.
are,
And I would say that's the difference between API, having an API and having an API first design. The Stripe is a good example of this. There's basically nothing that you can do through the Stripe UI that you can't do through the Stripe API because they first build the API and then they build the UIs on top of that. Same for AWS. Everything that you can do, basically everything you could do through the API is doable through the UI. When we say
totally.
we're an API first company, it's different from API only company, which is yes, we have UIs, but everything comes out with an API first. Anyways, continue.
Totally. And like, so that's a software choice for systems of record. Like headless content management systems were popular, like the first variant of like, or nomenclature of this, of like, okay, there's been WordPress and stuff that's a UI, but what if we did that with APIs too? And that became popular, and now there's headless EHRs, but those are competitive choices that vendors make to say, "Ooh, well, we're developer friendly." They are not, until to date, with information blocking, something that's been mandated. And with information blocking, it actually pushes and incentivizes vendors towards this headless route because, circling back, you have the actors, you have the actions, you have the exceptions. The court case showed, okay, even RPA, all the functions inclusive of there, if you block that and you don't offer an equivalent API, then you're information blocking because the exceptions prove to be very narrow. And so that incentive pushes people to either A, become headless, make APIs for everything, B, allow RPA in a controlled fashion, or C, do something else, MCP or directed database, some access pattern for every function that you can, otherwise you have to allow RPA. And so that is like crazy. It's like there's very few other laws in the US or internationally that have ever incentivized that set of behavior. You have in automotive dealer management systems, we both have some interest or history more in the car dealership side, but there's laws at the state level for data access rights that are close. You can squint and see similarities. There's the EU's Digital Markets Act, which for gatekeepers, which is an arbitrary bound that basically just to go after Google and Apple and others. They do similar interoperability mandates, but this is industry wide, size agnostic. If you are a developer of certified IT, you have this incentive to headlessness or openness, and so that's a very interesting policy experiment.
It's an interesting, kind of intuitively, it makes sense. If you're saying, hey, if there's an action that I, as a human who's a paying customer of pick your EHR, if I can do an action, then I should be able to have a robot, a machine, an AI agent, whatever, some sort of a process, take that action on my behalf. Now, to your point, is pretty much only done in healthcare, and with some other pieces here and there. Of course, when we talk about integrating with, you're going to integrate with NetSuite or SAP or Oracle or any of these systems or QuickBooks. You have the number one problem is that they're not standardized, so there's no requirement for exposing an API. But number two is like you have no guarantee that you're going to get access to that, and it's not there's no government regulatory mandate that says that, hey, you have to give access to anybody. So it is interesting. Like it's now you could argue whether that makes sense in other industries and why healthcare is so different. And I think it probably comes from the fear, or which is probably reasonable, of, hey, as a patient, I medical records are going to be held inside a walled garden, and those are going to be held hostage. But then caught in the crossfire of those like patient rights, there's been a lot of other stuff. So it's like billing data and these kind of quasi billing concerns where there's maybe a more questionable argument as to why is it so different that you should be able to extract a claim from a system, or an attachment of an X-ray from a system, versus extracting an invoice in the world of car dealerships or car parts.
Yeah, I mean, and I've talked to the antitrust crowd, like some of the lobbyists there. I've talked to different industries about this, and they're like, oh, maybe there's some interesting threads to pull. I think for healthcare, it's because, like you said, it's healthcare data. It's just this important thing for us to go and figure out, and so they're willing to be more interventionist than they are in other industries. Two, we paid for it is another common argument. Like $30 billion via the meaningful use era that already went directly to EHRs. They argue like, okay, well, we've paid that, and like that there's a utility angle of having paid for it that people haven't really fleshed out, but that's part of it. But by and large, like it's like, okay, if this policy experiment works and has positive outcomes, you could imagine it being expanded to other industries, right? The roles, the system of record, like an EHR, are transposable into banking, into property management, into construction, and those systems of record, they have the same incentive structures of, well, I've sold to an organization. To grow, I could sell to the next incremental organization. That's hard. Or I can upsell them on the next point solution and bundle things in. And so that pushes them to be inherently, unless they have virtue and grace inherently as a cultural value, like to preclude competition, to not build the APIs, right? Like being a system of record forces you down this track, and unless you have a better nature, where you are trying to squeeze and sell all the software, meet all the software needs of the healthcare organization. And so, yeah, you could see it replicated elsewhere potentially if it works, if it has productive outcomes. There is large burden to being open. There's large burden on these EHRs and systems of record to go and spend, instead of building the next UI element or feature for their customer base, the provider, to go and ensure that they're all APIs are built. There's actually APIs for every function or whatever it might be. And so people forget about the trade-offs of these things, but there are trade-offs, and so we'll see how it plays out. But I'm like intellectually, like this is really, let's see how the dice fall. Is where I'm at.
Yeah, I think the problem with expanding this to other industries is there's a lot of unintended consequences that happen from this, in terms of, if I could develop a feature that's UI only in my new ERP system, uh, versus knowing that I'm going to have to make that data. If I do so, I'm going to make that data accessible to everybody. You kind of are incentivizing people to not roll out features that could be very valuable to customers because they don't want that value to be arbitraged out to all manner of other systems that integrate with them. And so there's big cost to it. But it's I think that for better or for worse, there's healthcare, at least in the U.S., is thought of as this other the special category where special rules apply, and so I think you're at the forefront of regulatory action for better or for worse in some of these cases. Can you talk to us about you know to what extent is information blocking, we're 80% of the way through that story playing out versus, oh no, we're in the early innings and it's unclear, how far this is going to go in terms of clinical data versus administrative billing data. Where are we in terms of innings here?
Earliest of innings. So we have the point click care case 2 summers ago was like the first, like, cement something down and be like, oh, this is real. And now there's a variety of other cases. We have Vine, in the dental industry, is suing Henry Schein, one of the largest EHRs in the dental industry.
Can you walk us
Um,
through the tweet storm summary of what's going on there?
so Vine is like a clearinghouse of sorts. They, and I think other product lines too, but they were connecting to Henry Schein through direct to database. So the third of the three paradigms, you have APIs and interfaces, the things that are developed by a software vendor intentionally to connect to outside parties. You have RPA, the things developed by a software vendor to connect to users. And then you have the database, the place data is stored, which hypothetically you can go and connect to. Historically, that was very popular because it was just a database on a server that a provider or somebody might have. With SaaS vendors and things, it's now like, okay, that's locked away in the high castle. But it's still used in various capacities, both in healthcare and other industries, the right direct to database. So Vine was doing that, and then
And
Henry
was this
Schein.
for claims or attachments?
Yeah, it was for claims and clearinghouse functions to integrate with the EHR. It was like a print driver, if you really want to get the specifics. It was some sort of print driver interaction. You look through those legal briefs, you're like, oh boy, I feel bad for these lawyers having to parse out these really insane technical, you know, C sharp commands on the whatever. Like, I don't know. Like, it's just like, it's very technical, fun. It looks like hacking. And so that is the argument that Henry Schein is using in defending the computer fraud and things like that. That, okay, we had to do this from a security standpoint because look how crazy it is. But is that access, exchange, and use of EHI? Well, it does move the data. And are they blocking it without offering a viable alternative? Potentially, that remains to be litigated. Um, so that's what's going on there. And they're doing some fun things trying to tussle it between different jurisdictions because there's some state law elements that play into things here. So there's that lawsuit. There's the lawsuit against Epic. So there's two lawsuits. One's antitrust by Particle, but the one that's more pertinent to information blocking is CureIS versus Epic, where they claim that Epic, blocked them on several fronts from integrating with for the purposes of Medicaid, like enrollment. I think is like the broad space or something like that. And it's the same argument played out over and over and over again. There's a fourth, so that's Intis Care versus RTZ, and so that's in the PACE space, where a PACE analytics, where PACE is Medicaid and Medicare, sort of like the intersect. It's a very specific, like home healthy type of population, and that analytics solution was trying to connect to a major PACE EHR of sorts, and again, blocked from screen scraping. So we see these wars being fought that are being litigated and decided. And then as of last month, the government finally got rolling, got out of the shutdown, and said, you know what, we're going to drop HTI 5, which is from the Cures Act. We've had these health technology rules, HTI 1, 2, 3, 4, that have been sort of spawned off of that law of 2016. HTI 5 is deregulatory, and deregulated a bunch of criteria from the certification program, but also is proposing to deregulate away some of the exceptions to information blocking. So this administration is not your granddaddy's Republicans administration. It is they are like ready to use this very market changing, some would call market distorting law of information blocking to reset the equilibrium to allow innovators to connect. And in this rule, they said very explicitly, and also in a supplementary FAQ, they said our AI, RPA, and agents, that's all EHI exchange. No doubt, like you stop saying that it's not. And so they're very pro AI, very pro RPA, and it puts the onus on EHRs very clearly in a way that the court cases, they're like, well, that's the courts. What do the regulators say? Well, now the regulators are saying very clearly that they agree with the courts that EHRs, certified health IT, need to get it together, put together the APIs to allow for exchange, open exchange with pretty competitive solutions, and outcompete. And I think that's a pro-competitive law that antitrust stands would rejoice over. Like, you don't get that upstream. You get very, very downstream when you use antitrust. And so we'll see how it plays out. But you will see this year rapid deployment of APIs by EHRs, rapid deployment of controlled RPA and other paradigms to allow access by agents and things like that, so that they can at least partially, within the what's called the fees exception of information blocking, they can monetize, if they do so in a way that's commensurate with cost. Well, they might as well do that versus just be forced to allow unadulterated freewheeling RPA, which is the alternative in front of them right now, as the cards seem to lie. How will that play out? Will they start to use constitutional arguments like the takings clause? Like, yeah, they already are in court. So like they're going to push back on like really meaty like IP and constitutional arguments that will be fun to watch, or at least fun for me. I don't know if everyone gets their kicks this way.
Well, I think it's depends on whether you're on the beneficiary end of information blocking or not. I think it's probably less fun for these things to be playing out if you're depending on a walled garden.
Yeah, I mean, everyone wants asymmetry, right? Like if I came to you and said, "Hey, Zach, you're an actor now, and you gotta let us in. Got to certain terms, certain ways you can price." You'd be like, no, like nobody wants it when you think about it applied to your software. But it's something that you think about how the incredible gravitational power of systems of record for any industry, really any industry this applies to. When you purchased that big piece of software, like, oh man, that's our operating system. We can't possibly move on from the COBOL that's running it, or the, like whatever. It applies everywhere. It happens in every industry. And we look and we say, well, why is that so ancient over in construction or over in government? Why are they using Tyler Technologies? Why are they using, Yardi? It's because the gravitational pull for large enterprises, and once your data and workflow fits into these pieces of enterprise SaaS, is some of the strongest powers in technology. Mirrored. I guess the only competing one would be network effects. Like those are the only two that come close. I know we've talked about this, like Helmer's powers and which ones are the real ones. Like those two, yeah, brand's good. These other ones are good, but those two in tech are, you can have dog shit brand, and if you have these, you can persist indefinitely.
Well, my favorite example of this, of a system, a system of record is quote just a database. It's a database with workflows and a bunch of other stuff. But if you look at some of these big system of record companies like Oracle started as a database. And, the famous example of this is Amazon decided, in 2000 something, some of the early 2000s, that they wanted to get off of Oracle databases altogether. And I think it took them like 12 years to get all the way off. And that's with, they make databases. They make really good databases. And it's, I think Oracle touted this as, oh, look, like our database is so great that it took 12 years, that Amazon's trying to get off and they can't even get off. And I think that that's like, it's true, it is a great database, but if you look at the history of Oracle, what they did was they made the database more and more powerful so that it could do workflows and absorb business logic and all these different pieces. And so what happened is, Jeff Bezos' famous email where he dictated that all teams must interact via API, and they're, can't have direct database access to other teams. You could read that as a response to the poor design decisions that were made because the Oracle database was so powerful. So what happened was, the teams at Amazon in the early days built so much logic and functionality on a single database and then exposed that database access to other teams. And it took a decade to unwind the assumptions there of like a very highly motivated company building competitive products. Now, Oracle, of course, being quite smart, looked at this and said, hey, what's the difference between an ERP, like the actual applications that are built on top of these databases and the databases themselves? And so they went and they built NetSuite and Oracle and to compete with SAP, and eventually moved into the HR space as well.
Yeah, right. Like, there's three things that make switching costs real for and systems of record beyond just databases have it too, but databases have the data gravity, right? Like, just move. How do I ETL? How do I make sure it's moved in a way that to this new location, this new paradigm? There's workflow gravity, right? You start to build and accrue the workflows you do on top of it. Users are trained, they understand it. You have to go retrain them. You have to go, make sure that there's no lossiness there or minimal lossiness. And then you build this constellation of point solutions and other, automations and integrations around it. Those are all empowering. To do all that, to automate your business, is the promise of tech, but they are the three chains that drag you down and hold you back from moving on to something else. And they are, the weight of that is incredible, is astronomical. As is hard enough for someone to switch as a consumer from Apple to Android or back. Everyone ever since I moved back to the US has been like, get over to iOS, you green bubbler. And I'm like, oh, geez, man, I know everything
Do you want to
here.
take the productivity hit? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, that is one person for consumer software where they have done a ton of work to make that easy. And if you extrapolate that out, it is exponentially higher for a large business. And that's also why people don't move to cloud and all these things. It is because of those switching costs. And it's decades, to your point.
Shifting gears a little bit, when you look at the various, quote, pieces of technology that we have, the standards, I would also call information blocking a kind of a technological innovation in some ways, because it's changing the way that things are working. If, let's say, these information blocking court cases played out generally tending favorably towards more open access, and we saw no advancement of standards from the point that they are today, how much do you think, this is tough to give a percent to, but like what percent do you think we are through exploiting in a positive way, the beneficial substrate that we have today compared to what is possible?
No, we're just getting started. Like, my whole consultancy is built around people being like, "Well, I've tried to integrate." I'm like, "Well, you have left so much meat on the bone," because between the technical pieces, the technical standards, everything that is mandatorily required, people don't know about all of them. And then you add in the policy angle of going and asking for what now is a statutory, right, and people just haven't started to do that. And so, as they do that, we see the flip side of the coin. We've had EHRs reach out to us and engage and be like, hey, we want to lean into this because we see, one, as a threat, but two, as an opportunity. Like, we need to both duck any risk and also reinvent ourselves in a way that we allow for RPA and MCP and invite these things in. And the reality is, systems of record, for the reason we just talked about, even in a world where they're fully open, are still going to win a ton of deals, are still going to grow, because the default choice will not be another third party with different risk and liability. It will be the bundled solution. But at least um, in the world of information blocking, these point solutions that want to do good things, right now, they're dead in the water. They can't connect. Goodbye business. And now they get a chance. They can go be 10x better and appeal and navigate stakeholders and do all those things, when they have a chance to go make a business. And I think that is a cool policy experiment. As people start to use that muscle more and more, both sides of the equation will get better. It becomes less testy and aggressive, and it'll become more collaborative in a way that between at least between the in a pro-competitive co-opetition model. That's my op.
Super interesting. Well, closing question here. If there was one thing that you could change about, usually the question is revenue cycle management, but maybe we'll allow a little bit outside the bounds of that, given your areas of focus. If there's one thing that you could change um, for things to get better without requiring like a massive rewrite of the quote system, what would it be?
So FHIR is RESTful, right? It's a pull, it's a query base, and that filled a gap. Like it's a everything else was push space HL7. Well, now I want the push. I want the webhooks. I want FHIR subscriptions, and that's coming in, likely coming, rumored to be coming in HTI 6, the next rule. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit of a rewrite, but everyone's talking about it. It's going to happen, and that for like then you have this nice little cozy FHIR subscriptions to be enrolled to understand new events, RESTful queries to pull additional things, and then write back of some fashion. And so that to me would allow people a lot of applications that have to coexist with many different HL7 here, X12 here, FHIR here. Not all applications, but a broader subset could just do the jobs to be done in a API only, FHIR only way.
Yeah, for people who are not super familiar with webhooks and events, the difference between this pull based model, the RESTful gets that are there today, is that let's say I want to know when has Brendan's encounter finished, and I'm going to poll. So I'm going to every 15 minutes, I'm going to look for every one day, I'm going to look for an update to Brendan's chart or patient record or whatever it is in the EHR. And the more modern way of doing this is with a webhook. So when you get a payment via Stripe, they send an immediate instant notification to your API that says, "Hey, a new payment arrived," and that's what you're talking about with FHIR events.
Yeah, 100%. And what's crazy, like the RESTful APIs today, they're patient specific. So I can't do what the common workaround when you only have RESTful APIs is just polling. You hammer and you say, what's new across, like, are there any new orders as a question to the EHR and get back the list of new orders. That's not supported via the RESTful APIs today. So like there is a hole, and whether that's, allowing for polling, cross-population polling or FHIR subscriptions, like so putting something there, allowing for that allows for an API only ecosystem or for a number of applications.
Wow. Well, it was great to have you. We got to synthesize so many of the conversations and topics that we've touched on, although we had to leave off many more. So would love to have you back on the show at some point. And Brendan, thanks for spending the time.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Good to see you, Zach.